It happened at my daughter-in-law's funeral. Not at the hospital. Not at home. Not at the police station. Right there, in the front pew of a small church in Springfield, Illinois. March 15, 10:42 in the morning. The pastor had just cleared his throat and said my son's name. Mark Reynolds was a devoted husband, he told the room, his voice warm and steady. A man who never left his wife's side until her final breath. At that exact second, my phone vibrated in my hand. One sharp buzz. A bank alert. $4,860, hotel and bar charges. St. Louis, Missouri. Transaction date, yesterday. Cardholder, Mark Reynolds. My fingers went cold. I looked up from the screen and saw my son standing beside his wife's coffin, his head bowed just enough to look convincing. And on either side of him, too close, too familiar, stood two young women I had never seen before. Their hands rested lightly on his arms, as if they belonged there. Sarah was lying in a casket lined with white silk. Flowers crowded the aisle. Candles flickered beneath stained glass. My daughter-in-law was dead. And my son had been drinking, laughing, and spending money the night before her funeral. People around me dabbed their eyes. Someone squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "You raised such a good man." I couldn't breathe. As the pastor continued speaking about love and devotion, only one thought echoed through my head, louder than the hymns, louder than the organ, louder than my own heartbeat. How could they do this to me? If this story felt familiar, if it stirred something quiet inside you, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel to hear more true stories where silence is broken gently, and strength is found without shouting. Your presence here matters more than you know. My name is Linda Reynolds, and for most of my life I was the woman people called when something broke. I ran a construction company in Wisconsin for more than 25 years. I knew how to read contracts, negotiate loans, manage crews, and keep a business alive through recessions and winters that split concrete. I learned early that stability doesn't come from hope. It comes from preparation, discipline, and showing up even when you're tired. I raised my son alone after my husband died suddenly, the way many women do, quietly and without applause. I worked long days, came home smelling of sawdust and coffee, and still made sure there was dinner on the table. I taught Mark how to balance a checkbook before he could legally drink. I told him that debt was a promise you made to your future self, and breaking it always came with interest. When he married Sarah, I welcomed her like a daughter. She was soft-spoken, observant, the kind of woman who folded napkins neatly even when no one was watching. She thanked me for things most people wouldn't notice: rides, groceries, small favors. She listened more than she spoke. Mark, on the other hand, had grown comfortable. I bought them their house when the bank wouldn't approve the mortgage. I paid for his car after his temporary setback stretched into a year. I covered their insurance when premiums went up. When loans came due, I handled them. When mistakes were made, I corrected them. I told myself this was motherhood. I told myself this was love. What I didn't see then was how smoothly my help had become an expectation. How rarely anyone asked how I was doing. How quickly problems landed in my lap, already labeled urgent, while solutions were never anyone else's responsibility. Mark learned that if he waited long enough, I would step in. Sarah learned to stay quiet. They lived behind my back, in a soft net of assumptions I had woven myself. They knew that if anything went wrong, rent, utilities, medical bills, taxes, Mom would fix it. I always had. I used to be proud of that strength. Proud that I could carry what others dropped. Proud that my son never had to worry the way I once did. Standing in that church, listening to lies dressed up as devotion, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. They weren't leaning on me. They were using me. And the worst part was not that I had been generous. It was that my generosity had made it easier for cruelty to hide in plain sight. A year before Sarah died, she stood across from me in the kitchen, slowly turning a teacup in her hands, as if the answer might appear on the porcelain if she waited long enough. It was late afternoon. The light had softened, slipping across the counter in a way that made everything look gentler than it was. The kettle clicked off. The refrigerator hummed. The house felt settled, ordinary, safe. That was why I almost didn't hear the weight behind her words. "Linda," she said, very quietly, "if something ever happens to me, please check the top drawer of my desk." I laughed softly and waved my hand, the way people do when they want to brush a thought aside before it settles. I told her not to talk like that. I told her she was young, that she was healthy, that she worried too much. I said it with kindness. I meant it. She nodded. Slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't smile either. I understand now that what I mistook for agreement was resignation. After that afternoon, the changes didn't arrive like alarms. They arrived like dust. So fine you only noticed once it had already settled everywhere. Her debit card stopped working once. Then again. Mark said it was a banking issue, some technical problem that would clear itself up. He spoke confidently, with irritation at being questioned, and I accepted the explanation because it was easier than pressing further. Doctor appointments were postponed. Next month, Sarah said at first. Then, after things calmed down. Later, when we can afford it. Each answer was delivered gently, as if she were the one trying not to burden me. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, deepening over time. She lost weight. Her clothes hung differently, sleeves loose where they hadn't been before. When I offered to make an appointment myself, she hesitated, then glanced toward Mark, as if checking permission before speaking. The house grew colder. Even in early spring, she wore sweaters indoors. Her hands were often tucked into her sleeves. When I commented on the temperature, Mark shrugged and said they were cutting costs. Sarah nodded, but her jaw tightened just slightly. She spoke less. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Carefully. Her sentences shortened. Her opinions disappeared. When Mark interrupted her, she stopped mid-thought and didn't return to it. When he answered questions meant for her, she let him. I noticed how often her eyes dropped to the floor. Mark changed too. He became sharper, quicker to irritate, always tired in a way that excused everything. He talked about pressure, about responsibility, about how hard it was to be the one holding things together. When I offered help, he accepted it immediately. When I asked questions, he dismissed them. I told myself marriage was complicated. I told myself not to interfere. I told myself they were adults. Still, small moments stayed with me. The way Sarah lingered when she hugged me goodbye, arms wrapped just a second too long. The way she thanked me for coming, as if my presence itself was something rare. Once, she whispered, "It's good you're here," and the words felt heavier than they should have. I sensed something was wrong, not logically, but physically. Like the air before a storm. Still, I chose explanation over action. Stress made sense. Exhaustion made sense. Admitting the truth did not. Because if I had opened that drawer then, I would have had to act. And acting would have meant admitting that love alone was not protecting her. And that realization terrified me. When I flew to Springfield without warning, Sarah was already in the intensive care unit. No one had called me. I didn't get a trembling message in the middle of the night, no frantic voicemail, no polite update. I learned by accident, from a neighbor who asked if everything was all right because an ambulance had sat outside their house for nearly an hour. I booked the first flight I could afford, packed an overnight bag, and arrived with that sick feeling that comes when you realize you are already late to your own life. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and burned coffee. The floors shone with that waxy glare that makes every step sound too loud. A television murmured in the waiting area, tuned to a morning show nobody watched. At the ICU desk, a nurse checked the name on my driver's license, then looked back at the screen with a tight expression. "She's been here 2 days," she said. "Are you family?" "Yes," I answered, and the word came out steadier than I felt. She handed me a visitor sticker and pointed to a sign about limited hours, then lowered her voice. "She's very sick," she said, as if she didn't want the walls to hear. "We've had trouble reaching her emergency contact." I swallowed. That would be my son. Sarah lay behind a glass door under harsh lights. Her skin looked too pale against the sheets, and her lips were cracked, as if she'd been stranded somewhere without water. Tubes ran from her arms. A monitor blinked and beeped in small, impatient bursts. I took her hand and was startled by how light it felt, more like holding a bird than a grown woman. A doctor met me in the hallway, coat pockets heavy, eyes tired. He spoke carefully, the way people do when they know the truth will land hard. Double pneumonia. Severe dehydration. Exhaustion so deep her body had begun to shut down. She had a fever over 104, he said, for at least 4 days. Possibly longer. Without medical care. 4 days. I kept hearing that number as if it were a sentence. I asked where my son was. The doctor blinked, then glanced at the chart. "Her husband signed the intake," he said, "but we haven't seen him since yesterday morning." I walked to the stairwell and called Mark. It rang until voicemail. I called again. And again. On the 4th try he answered, his voice loud with background noise, like he was somewhere with music. "Mom," he said, annoyed, as if I'd interrupted him. "Where are you?" I asked. "Sarah is in ICU." A pause. Then a sigh. "I'm handling it," he said. "They've got her. I can't do anything sitting there." "Come now," I told him, keeping my voice flat. "Come and look at her." He said, "I'll be there soon," the same way he used to say soon when he forgot to pick up his own laundry. I sat by Sarah's bed as the hours crawled. I wiped her forehead with a damp cloth the nurse brought me. I watched her chest rise and fall like it was doing work she hadn't agreed to. At one point her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and she made a small sound, half question, half apology. I leaned close and told her, "I'm here. You don't have to talk. Just breathe." I watched the 4 drip count out seconds like a metronome. A nurse adjusted Sarah's pillow and told me, gently, that they could only do so much if she kept arriving too late. I nodded because if I spoke, the truth might spill out in a way I couldn't take back. I kept my hand on hers until dawn finally came. Around dusk, I stepped outside for air. The sky had turned the color of bruised steel. The wind cut through my coat and carried the sour smell of exhaust from the road. From the curb, I saw a familiar BMW glide past the hospital entrance, the one I had paid for, believing I was giving my son stability. Music spilled from the open windows. 2 young women sat in the passenger seats, laughing, hair shining under the streetlights. Mark's face flashed by for a second, lit by the dashboard. He didn't look toward the building. He didn't slow down. I went back upstairs with my hands shaking, and before I reached the unit my phone buzzed. "Mom," his text read, "I'm with Sarah. Haven't left her side." I stopped in the corridor, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and stared at the screen until the words blurred. It wasn't even a good lie. It was the kind of lie you tell when you assume the other person will accept anything. In that moment, something in me went quiet. Not rage. Not hysteria. Just a clean, unmistakable understanding. Sarah lay fighting for her life a few doors away. And my son was lying as easily as he breathed. I returned to her bedside and sat down, listening to the steady beep of the monitor, the soft hiss of oxygen, the distant squeak of a cart rolling past. I brushed her hair back, the way I used to when she was well, and I promised her, quietly, firmly, that she was not alone. And for the first time, I stopped protecting the story Mark wanted the world to believe. I went back to their house the next morning while Sarah lay unconscious in the ICU. The neighborhood looked the same, trim lawns, pale driveways, flags stiff in the March wind, but I felt like I was walking into a building after a fire, expecting the walls to fall. Mark hadn't answered my calls. No one had offered to meet me. The key on my ring felt heavier than usual as I slid it into the lock. Inside, the air was cold. Not a little chilly, but the kind of cold that sinks into your wrists. The thermostat read 60. A lemon cleaner smell clung to the kitchen, trying too hard to say everything was fine. On the counter, a half-empty bottle of vodka sat beside a stack of takeout menus, as casual as a fruit bowl. Sarah's lavender candle, one I'd given her at Christmas, was burned down to a blackened wick. I set my bag down and stood still, listening. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere, a clock ticked. I realized I was holding my breath, as if sound might provoke something. Then I walked to Sarah's desk. It was tucked into the corner of the spare room, beneath a framed wedding photo. In the picture, she leaned into Mark with a soft smile, her eyes bright. I studied that face for a second and felt a sharp, clean sadness, because I could see how hard she had tried. The top drawer stuck when I pulled it. Swollen wood, stubborn rails. I tugged again and it gave with a small scrape, like it didn't want to reveal what it held. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, clipped receipts, and a thin notebook with a cracked blue cover. Her diary. Beside it, a folder labeled medical in careful block letters, and another labeled banking. My hands steadied as I opened the notebook. Not because I was calm, but because something in me had finally set. She wrote in short entries, dated, precise. February 2nd, he took my paycheck again. Said it was 4 bills. I asked for the login. He changed it. February 11th, he sold my gold necklace. The one from Mom. Told me not to be dramatic. February 19th, heat turned down. Says I complain too much. I slept in my coat. February 27th, he came home smelling like perfume. Said it was from the office. I don't believe him. March 3rd, I tried to call Linda, but he stood in the doorway. I said I was fine. I wasn't. Then, written heavier than the rest. If I get sick, I don't think he'll help. I closed the diary and opened the banking folder. There were printouts, small, careful screenshots from a banking app. Transfers marked cash, withdrawals, charges at bars and hotels. In the margins, Sarah had written totals in pencil, like she was trying to make the numbers tell her she was wrong. One page showed a jewelry store buyback slip. Another showed a casino ATM fee, circled twice. I wasn't wrong. She wasn't wrong. I sat at her desk and dialed my lawyer. I didn't ask what to do. I told him what I needed, freeze what I controlled, cut off access, and protect Sarah's interests immediately. By noon, accounts tied to my company and my personal guarantees were locked down. By evening, the house deed was being moved into Sarah's name, with paperwork filed to prevent Mark from touching it. I instructed the dealership to begin the process of repossessing and selling the BMW registered under my business. I paid the hospital directly, over the phone, listening to the billing clerk read back numbers while the hallway speaker called codes I didn't understand. I asked for itemized statements. I asked for timestamps. I asked who had signed what. Each answer felt like another nail set straight. When Mark finally appeared at the ICU that night, he wore the same expression he'd worn at every school meeting and every late bill, concerned, annoyed, certain I would fix it. "Mom," he said, leaning in as if we were on the same side, "why are you making this harder?" I handed him copies. Statements. Dates. Amounts. A screenshot of the St. Louis hotel charge with his name attached to it. He flipped through them, then looked up, his mouth half open. "You went through our things." "I went through Sarah's drawer," I said. "The one she told me to check." His eyes hardened. She was emotional. She was accurate, I replied. At the funeral, when it was my turn to speak, I didn't tell stories about casseroles or anniversaries. I held my phone in my palm like a stone and read the dates out loud. March 14th, St. Louis Hotel. March 12th, bar tabs. March 9th, cash withdrawals. I watched people's faces change as the timeline formed in their minds. I watched one of Mark's friends stare down at his shoes. The church grew very quiet. Someone stopped crying. The pastor stopped looking at my son. The two young women beside him shifted first, then slipped out the side door, heels clicking fast on the tile, leaving Mark standing alone by the casket now. Sarah didn't live long enough to watch consequences unfold. But she did not die unseen. And neither did the truth. The consequences did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. They came quietly, methodically, the way real consequences usually do. Mark lost his job first. Not because I called his employer. Not because I demanded punishment. The truth simply began to circulate, carried by people who had sat in that church and heard dates spoken out loud. A coworker asked a question he couldn't answer cleanly. Another noticed the timeline didn't match the stories Mark had told for months. By Monday morning, Human Resources wanted a meeting. By Monday afternoon, he was asked to clear out his desk. He told people it was restructuring. He said the company was downsizing. But explanations grow thin when too many people know the same truth. Next came the house. The transfer paperwork finalized while Sarah was still alive, though unconscious. Her signature, given earlier under calmer circumstances, carried more weight than Mark expected. When he tried to contest it, he discovered what I had learned over decades of contracts and courts: documents don't care how loudly you argue. The locks were changed. Utilities were moved. The heat was turned back on. Just not for him. Friends drifted away in stages. Some stopped answering calls. Some offered brief replies, polite but distant. A few confronted him directly and then disappeared. Social circles close ranks when behavior becomes indefensible. The two young women from the funeral did not reappear. They vanished as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only an awkward memory and unanswered questions. The BMW was sold within days. I received the confirmation email while sitting beside Sarah's hospital bed, the glow of my phone reflected faintly in the glass. I transferred every dollar directly to the hospital billing department and asked for a receipt. Then I asked for another, itemized. The balance lowered. Not enough. But lower. Mark came to see me after that. He found me in the hospital corridor, sitting in one of those plastic chairs designed to discourage comfort. A paper cup of coffee had gone cold in my hands. His eyes were red. His clothes wrinkled, like he'd slept in them. He didn't begin with anger. He knelt. Right there on the floor, in a place where people whispered and machines beeped, he dropped to his knees and clutched my coat like a lifeline. "I know I messed up," he said. "I wasn't thinking. I can change. Just help me fix this." I looked down at him and waited for the old reflex, the instinct to pull him up, to smooth things over, to say we'd figure it out together. It never came. "You didn't make one mistake," I said evenly. "You built a pattern." He looked up, confused. "You repeated it," I continued. "You benefited from it. And you kept it going by letting someone else suffer." He said Sarah wouldn't have wanted this. He said family forgives. He said I was being cruel. When none of that worked, he asked for money. "Not much," he said. "Just enough to get started again." I thought of the diary. The cold house. The unanswered fever. The lie sent while she lay dying. "I don't rescue grown men who destroy others," I told him. Security arrived quietly. He stood, wiped his face with his sleeve, and walked away without looking back. After Sarah died, the rest unfolded without drama. Probate closed. Claims were resolved. The foundation paperwork finalized under her name. Mark contested nothing after his lawyer reviewed the file. The last message I received from him came months later. "I hope you're happy." I read it once, then deleted it. Because happiness was never what I was choosing. I was choosing accountability. And for the first time, it had nowhere to hide. After everything was settled, after the documents were signed, the claims resolved, and the phone finally stopped ringing, my life became quieter than it had ever been. Not the sharp silence that follows shock, but a steady, breathable quiet. The kind that lets you hear yourself think again. I sold the old house and moved into a smaller one near a public park. It had wide windows, pale floors, and a kitchen that caught the morning light. The first night there, I slept without waking to check my phone. No emergencies. No requests. No explanations waiting to be made. In the mornings, I brewed cinnamon tea and stood by the window while the park came alive. Joggers passed. A woman walked her dog the same route every day at exactly 8:30. Children fed birds crumbs they weren't supposed to give them. Life continued without consulting me, and for the first time, that felt like relief. I kept only a few things from my old life. One chipped blue mug. A wool scarf. A framed photo of Sarah standing in my kitchen, flour on her hands, smiling like she'd been surprised by happiness. I didn't hide it. I didn't center it. I let it exist. The foundation I started in Sarah's name grew slowly. I never wanted it to be loud. I wanted it to be useful. I met women in borrowed offices and quiet cafes. I listened more than I spoke. I paid for locks to be changed, deposits to be covered, consultations to be scheduled. I didn't promise miracles. I offered traction. Some days were heavier than others. Grief doesn't disappear just because you've made peace with your choices. It shows up in ordinary moments. In the scent of lavender soap. In the way winter light falls across a table. In a sentence you almost say out loud before remembering there's no one there to answer. When that happened, I didn't scold myself. I sat with it. I learned that grief, like strength, is something you carry, not something you conquer. People told me I looked calmer. Lighter. They asked what my secret was, as if there were one. There's no secret, I told them. I stopped pretending. I stopped pretending love meant endurance. I stopped pretending silence was kindness. I stopped pretending that boundaries were cruelty. Mark became a distant fact of my life, like an old address I no longer used. I heard updates now and then, always secondhand. Temporary jobs. Temporary places. Stories that shifted depending on who was listening. I didn't correct them. I didn't engage. Distance, I learned, can be an act of care for yourself. In the evenings, I lit a candle and read until my eyes grew tired. Sometimes I walked the park path after dark, wrapped in my scarf, listening to the rhythm of my own steps. I noticed how my shoulders no longer stayed tense. How my breath settled lower in my chest. I wasn't rebuilding a life I had lost. I was building one I had never been allowed to have. Quiet. Honest. Whole. And in that balance, not perfect, but true, I finally felt at home in myself. People often ask me now if I hate my son. They lower their voices when they ask, as if hatred is the proper response, as if it would make the story easier to understand. I tell them no. Hatred takes too much energy, and it keeps you tied to the very thing you're trying to survive. What I feel instead is clarity. I loved my son. I still do, in the quiet, distant way you love someone you no longer trust with your heart or your home. Love does not disappear just because truth arrives. But love, I learned, does not excuse cruelty. For a long time, I thought motherhood meant endurance. That it meant absorbing damage so others wouldn't have to. I believed strength was staying silent, fixing mistakes, smoothing over what shouldn't have happened in the first place. I was wrong. Real strength is looking directly at what is happening and refusing to lie about it. Even when the truth costs you the person you raised. Even when it leaves an empty chair where forgiveness used to sit. Sarah taught me that without ever meaning to. She tried to speak in small ways. In pauses. In glances. In a single sentence about a drawer. When I finally listened, it was too late to save her life, but not too late to honor it. I don't replay the past anymore, wondering what I should have done sooner. Regret is another form of punishment, and I've had enough of that. I focus on what is in front of me, quiet mornings, honest work, and choices that let me sleep at night. Sometimes, to save one life, you must let another go, not with anger, but with resolve. I chose peace. And if this story touched a nerve in you, you are not alone. Subscribe to hear more truths, where silence finally becomes strength.